1951. The Cold War simmers around the world, with flashpoints in Korea and a nuclear standoff in Europe. Long before long-range nuclear missiles, nuclear bombers are the only way of delivering an attack into enemy territory. Transporting nuclear bombs around the world is a vital task and falls to the U.S. Strategic Air Command's fleet of large transport planes. When one plane goes missing, questions abound, but answers are in short supply. What happened to the crew of Flight 5882 over the freezing waters of the North Atlantic?
And we have declared war on tyranny and aggression. And we not only stand for these things, but we're willing to stand up and die for these things.
Strategic Air Command was established directly after the war to control the U.S. fleet of strategic bombers. While they carried the heavy task of delivering nuclear weapons, they also engaged in more conventional conflicts, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on North Korea during the U.S. deployment there. For transporting nuclear weapons and personnel, SAC turned to the massive Douglas C-124 Globemaster II. Entering service in 1950, the C-124 was as tall as a 5-story building, and could transport 74,000 pounds of cargo or 200 troops. In March 1951, a C-124 of the 2nd Strategic Support Squadron took off from Walker Air Force Base in Roswell, New Mexico. Air Force Flight 5882 was bound for RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, England, one of SAC's primary operating fields in the United Kingdom, housing B-29 superfortresses. The flight had planned stopovers in Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, and Limestone Air Force Base in Maine. Aboard were passengers and equipment of the 509th Bomb Wing and Brigadier General Paul Cullen, Vice Commander of the 2nd Air Force, who was en route to take command of the newly established 7th Air Division. The flight proceeded without incident, reaching Limestone Air Force Base at 12:30 Zulu time on March 22nd, after spending the night in Barksdale. The crew received a weather briefing and took off in the late afternoon, routing north over Gander, Newfoundland. Flight 5882 intended to fly east over the Atlantic, giving regular position reports to the weather ships in its path. Everything seemed routine. The flight called ahead to Shannon Air Radio in Ireland at about 1 a.m. to report a revised time of arrival 30 minutes earlier than expected. They reported their position as 800 miles southwest of Ireland. A short time later, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Casco, on station in the middle of the Atlantic, received a mayday call from Flight 5882. The crew reported a fire in one of the crates in the cargo hold and jettisoned it from the plane. Unable to put out the fire, the flight commander decided the plane would ditch in the Atlantic. Moments later, the plane touched down in the water, and the passengers and crew took the life rafts. They reported their last position as 270 nautical miles away from the duty station of the Casco. A B-50 Superfortress of the 509th Bomb Wing was launched from England to locate the plane. The B-50 reported locating the rafts of the C-124 following flares fired by the crew in the early hours of March 24th, almost 24 hours after the plane had lost contact. However, the bomber lacked any rescue equipment that could be dropped for the crew, and they circled the rafts until being forced to continue back to base due to low fuel. No rescue craft would reach the site until the Casco later that day. When the Casco arrived, all that could be found were a few charred pieces of wreckage and a valise belonging to Captain Rafferty, a passenger aboard the flight. As for the 53 men aboard, including Brigadier General Cullen, they had simply vanished into the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The search for the men of Flight 5882 was one of the largest undertaken at the time. Over 100 aircraft and ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea, scoured hundreds of miles of open ocean southwest of Ireland. Except for the items recovered by the Casco, nothing could be found. The search was called off on March 31st, the men all presumed drowned. What had become of the men of Flight 5882? Conflicting reports, testimony, and theories mean the answer is shrouded in mystery to this day. The 6-man rafts aboard the C-124 were well equipped for survival in the event of ditching. Food, water, signal flares, cold weather suits, life vests, and Gibson Girl emergency radios were provided. The bomber crews aboard the flight were specifically trained to survive this type of ditching in the North Atlantic. The B-50 Superfortress's report of flares indicated that at least some of the men had escaped the plane alive. And, indeed, the lack of recovered bodies seemed to confirm this fact. But where had they gone? And, indeed, where had the plane gone? The Air Force's accident report noted that there was an amount of evidence suggesting the plane had touched down intact. 2 inflated aircraft tires were on board, and they were never recovered. Had the plane broken up before or after impact, the tires would have probably been found floating in the area where it crashed. The charred debris was burned by a fuel fire from the wing fuel cells, indicating that they, too, were still attached to the plane when it hit the water. Suspicions of Soviet involvement surfaced quickly. Soviet submarines and vessels were active in the North Atlantic from the beginning of the Cold War, often shadowing weather ships like the Casco. It is not impossible to think that a Soviet vessel, upon hearing the plane's distress calls, arranged for the men to be picked up by submarines and spirited back to Russia. Considering the value of Brigadier General Cullen, this would have been a major intelligence coup in the early years of the Cold War. However, no concrete evidence for this theory has ever surfaced, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. Indeed, the idea that the Soviet Navy would undertake such a risky maneuver when so many ships and planes were deployed in the search, as well as the difficulty of hiding the kidnapping of 53 people after so long, seems to refute this theory. Intense speculation also surrounds the fire that brought the plane down in the first place. The idea of mechanical failure seemed unlikely. The C-124 was virtually brand new at the time, with only 325 hours of flight on the airframe. The official Air Force report, while not concluding decisively why the crash had occurred, proposed that a propeller or a propeller cuff might have detached in flight, striking the plane and causing a fire or an explosion that brought it down. This theory was contradicted by the manufacturer of the plane, Douglas, who pointed out that the ball bearings in the cuff had been recently replaced, and in any event such a thing had never occurred before. The official report has, in the almost 70 years since the crash, come under criticism for its failure to include a number of sources of evidence in its conclusions. Notably, the logbook of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Casco was not consulted, and the evidence from it not included in the report. Indeed, the report makes no mention of a mayday call to the Casco at all. Despite the report's ambiguous conclusions, the charred debris found seems to conclusively prove that a fire was what doomed the plane. So what had started the fire? Tests performed on the burned debris indicated chemicals consistent with a 4-pound incendiary bomb, the AN-M50, which was used extensively by the Allies in firebombing campaigns during the Second World War. A bomb of this type was not listed on the cargo manifest. If an M50 had been on board, was it placed there to deliberately fell the plane? Or was it an accidental ignition of a piece of secret cargo? If the crew did know about the incendiary device, what was it doing on a Strategic Air Command flight half a decade after World War II ended? The mystery deepens with the plane's movements before leaving the North American coast. The original flight plan specified that the plane would land at Gander to be refueled before continuing across the Atlantic. The crew changed the plan in flight to land at Limestone instead. While on the ground in Limestone, the plane sat, apparently unattended, though supposedly locked, for several hours while the crew received their weather briefing. If the plane was sabotaged, then the hours the plane sat alone would have been a perfect time to sneak a timed explosive on board. Or perhaps the plane diverted to Limestone to pick up a piece of secret cargo that could not be picked up in Canada. Besides the apparent presence of an M50, what else was the plane carrying? The official report states that KB-50 bomb bay fuel tanks were the main cargo. However, the SAC did commonly use the C-124 for transporting nuclear weapons. Shortly after the crash of the plane, rumors it had a nuclear weapon on board began to circulate. The Air Force emphatically denied these rumors, but it was not outside the realm of possibility that 5882 was carrying a nuclear device. One theory proposed by modern-day researchers is that 5882 did have an atomic bomb on board, and that when the plane went down, the government enacted a cover-up to avoid embarrassment. A little more than a year earlier, the US had experienced its first broken arrow loss of a nuclear weapon in British Columbia, when a B-36 bomber had been forced to eject its Mark IV nuclear bomb in midair following the failure of 3 of its 6 engines. The bomb's conventional explosives detonated, spraying uranium over a section of the Canadian wilderness. The USAF still maintains that the bomb did not have the plutonium core necessary for detonation when it was ejected from the B-36. At the time of the C-124's crash, however, the B-36 had still not been located, and the US had not informed the Canadians that a nuclear weapon had been on board the crashed bomber. The loss of another nuclear device after only a year would be a major embarrassment for the United States, and might have put the US's strategy of basing nuclear bombers in the UK into question. All this speculation, however, has failed to be realized in the form of concrete evidence as to what happened to Flight 5882. To this day, the answer of where Brigadier General Cullen and the rest of the men aboard went, or why their plane crashed, has eluded their families and modern-day researchers. The scenarios are many: intentional sabotage or a freak accident, the involvement of the Soviets, or even a cover-up by the US Air Force. Unfortunately, it seems that the most likely explanation for what happened to the men is also the most grim. Cold, alone, and running out of food and water, the men of Flight 5882 may have simply slipped into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, never to be found. Today, 4 empty graves for men aboard Flight 5882 stand in Arlington National Cemetery, a chilling reminder of one of the greatest mysteries of the Cold War. Thank you for watching. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, let me know below. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe for more.